Hey everyone, Final Cut Pro 10.6.6 is here, and you're watching the only channel on YouTube that will show you on day one how all the new tools and features work to make your storytelling more creative and productive. I have several features I'm super excited to walk you through, the first of which is how to import projects created on Final Cut Pro for iPad. By the way, if you haven't heard, Final Cut Pro for iPad is available on the App Store today, and my buddy Mark created a 38-minute video to get you up and running. Check it out below using the link. But since this video is focused on Final Cut Pro for Mac, there's a great AI mask effect and a brand new approach to working with HDR content that I'm sure you'll be excited about. So let's get into it. Importing a project you edited on Final Cut Pro for iPad will take me less than a minute to explain. With Final Cut Pro open, go to the File menu and choose Import Final Cut Pro for iPad Project. Then navigate to the project bundle that you presumably airdropped to your Mac. Then click Import. You'll be prompted to save a new Final Cut Pro library to your system, and once imported, it will show up in the library sidebar. Select the event to browse your clips and open your projects. The timeline opens in the last saved state of the project, with all your edits, effects, color corrections, titles, and audio adjustments faithfully reconstituted. With regard to color correction, Final Cut Pro Mac includes a new color adjustments corrector that mirrors the color correction experience on Final Cut Pro for iPad that uses sliders, not wheels. But this is not the only reason Apple added this color corrector. I'll have more to say about this later in the video. Final Cut Pro for iPad also includes a live drawing tool that allows you to add animated drawings to your videos. Since they're created as separate clips, they also appear this way on Final Cut Pro for Mac. You cannot change the drawing aesthetics in any way, but you can adjust the animation timing in the inspector. So that's it for this feature. I'm hoping Apple will add the ability to go the other direction in future updates. Final Cut Pro 10.6.6 has a new scene removal mask that uses machine learning to isolate the subject from the background so that you can replace it with a different background. You can think of it as an auto-generated green screen key without the green screen. Now, with all the potential uses for this new mask effect, there's some things you need to keep in mind when shooting to ensure the best result. For starters, make sure that your background is static and that your camera is mounted on a tripod. Now, Apple recommends shooting in a bright, evenly lit indoor environment. I'm shooting in my spare bedroom using a single soft light as my key light. As for the background, it's just a plain wall with no complex patterns, colors, or shadows that could potentially confuse the algorithm. You can also help out the AI by ensuring there's good contrast and separation between the subject and the background. I'm standing a few feet away from the wall, and I'm wearing a dark shirt. Next, with your subject completely out of the frame, record a few seconds of just the background. Then step back into the frame and begin your delivery. Welcome to another edition of Mac Break Studio. In Final Cut Pro, I've imported a clip of my daughter Kate and placed it into a project. I'm going to replace the background with one of the new dynamic title templates that downloaded with this update. I'll open the effects browser by pressing Command 5, then scroll down to the newly consolidated masks and keying category, locate the scene removal mask, then drop it on the clip. Instantly, the background is removed, with the black areas in the viewer being fully transparent. To better evaluate the mask, I'll press Command Comma to call up the settings window and change the player background to checkerboard. Skimming over the clip reveals a very good key. By the way, I prefer using the word key instead of mask because it more appropriately describes what this effect is actually doing. For example, I'll skim to this frame as Kate turns her head and zoom in. Like any green screen keyer you might use, you'll often spend time adjusting the controls to preserve as much hair detail as possible to make the subject blend naturally into the background. Here, machine learning figured it all out automatically and created semi-transparent pixels along the edges of the subject, including the often challenging to get right loose strands of hair. Changing the channel view to alpha shows the opaque areas of the key in white and the semi-transparent areas in gray, and you can see that her hair detail is nicely preserved. Skimming over to this frame, we see that the AI also accounts for the natural motion blur in her hand movements. I'll reset the channel view, return the player background to black, and close the settings window, then zoom back out. Now at this point you may be asking yourself, will the effect allow me to adjust the key if I need to? Well, the short answer is no. It basically does all the work for you, which is why it's important that you adhere to the shooting steps I presented earlier. Opening the inspector, you'll see that there's only one control for this effect, labeled Reference. This pop-up menu allows you to choose a different reference frame relative to the clean background plate you recorded sans subject. The options are first frame plus 1 second, last frame minus 1 second, and last frame. In order for this mask effect to work, you must record the background without the subject in it at either the beginning or end of your shot. I'll move the play to the beginning of the clip, then disable the effect so you can see that I recorded a few seconds of the background before Kate entered the frame. I should also point out that the clean background must be included in the same clip your subject appears in, and not in a separate clip of just the background. By default, the effect uses the first frame of the clip as its reference frame. However, the first frame may not be entirely clean. Your hand might appear briefly in the shot as you're pressing the record button, or perhaps you accidentally bump the tripod. By choosing first frame plus 1 second, the mask effect will use a different reference frame, exactly 1 second from the start of the clip. If you didn't record a reference frame at the beginning, you can use a reference frame at the end of the clip, assuming you recorded it. Now, I didn't shoot a reference frame at the end of Kate's take, but I'll choose this option anyway because I want to show you what your key will look like if you forget to shoot a clean reference frame. I'll set this back to first frame. Also, in case you need a reminder of how to get good results using this effect, click this button to bring up a window listing best shooting practices and tips. So how does this effect work with a subject shot on more challenging backgrounds? Here's a shot of me in my studio standing in front of a gray brick pattern wall with some bookshelves on the left and red acoustic panels on the right. To challenge the algorithm even further, I waved my hands over these areas in the background. I've already applied the effect, so I'll just enable it in the inspector. I'll skim over the clip to check my key. The key is pretty impressive. As I skim, I'm noticing some chatter in the mask along the top edge of my head. That may have to do with the gray in my hair and the similarly colored wall, but it's hard to know for sure. Also, the edges around my fingers are showing some bleed through from the background. But given the complex nature of the background, the AI did a remarkable job. Not perfect, but more than passable. I'll press C to select the clip, press Command L to enable loop playback, then press the / key to play the selection. As the clip loops, I'll enable the connected audition clip that contains 2 motion backgrounds. Depending on the replacement background you choose, any imperfections in the key will often go unnoticed. By the way, I should mention that the motion backgrounds I'm demoing is part of a new set of generators found in the Titles and Generators sidebar. Just locate the Dynamic Backgrounds category and skim to preview them. Oh look, Apple named one of the backgrounds after my company. Thanks, Apple. So how does this scene removal mask work on a subject shot outdoors? Let me show you. In the next clip, I'm standing in front of my house on a cloudy afternoon. I deliberately placed myself in front of the busiest background I could find. I'll enable the scene removal mask in the inspector. Again, the result looks impressive, but you can't judge the quality of a key on a single static frame. I'll play the clip and you'll see there's some edge chatter around the left side of my head. The AI seems to be having a hard time dealing with the fence railing directly behind me. Depending on what your goal is, even a less than perfect key can provide some interesting creative options. Let me show you a few. I'll open the effects browser, locate Comic Looks, and skim over them. Because these effects are highly stylized, any imperfections in the mask will seem like they're part of the look. I'll drop the comic sepia onto the clip. Then enable the background. With the similar tones of the subject in the background, I've quickly created a cool look for a bumper or title. If I want, I can turn on 2D transforms and reposition the subject in the frame and scale it as needed to make room for some titles. Let me show you another way I might use this mask effect. I'll disable the motion background by selecting it and pressing V. In the inspector, I'll reset the transforms and disable the comic effect. I'll temporarily disable the scene removal mask in order for you to see that the background is in focus, and perhaps I want to make it look out of focus. I'll re-enable the mask. With the playhead parked over the clip, press Shift F to locate the browser clip. I'll skim to the reference frame Then from the Edit menu, choose Connect Freeze Frame. Trim the freeze frame to match the clip below it. In the Blur category of the Effects browser, locate the Gaussian Blur effect and drop it on the freeze frame. In the inspector, I'll set the amount to 15. To composite this freeze frame behind the masked clip, select it, then in the inspector choose Behind from the Blend Mode pop-up menu. Skimming over it, I now have a composite that looks like it was shot with a shallow depth of field. Now you may have noticed that I only applied a slight blur amount. For an effect like this, less is more, and it's certainly no worse than shooting with cinematic mode on my iPhone. You can also add titles between the masked clip and the background. Currently, the background clip is connected above the masked clip, and its blend mode is set to behind, which in the digital stacking order places it below the masked clip. So it's above the masked clip physically in the timeline, but it appears behind the masked clip in the viewer. Confused yet? Now there are reasons you might want to set up your composites this way, but that's a lesson for another day. I'll set the blend mode back to normal, then drag the background clip below the masked clip. The result in the viewer is exactly the same as before, but this time the background is physically below the masked clip in the stacking order. Next, I'll open the 3D Titles category and connect one of the 3D titles to the masked clip in the primary storyline. The title appears above everything because it has priority in the stacking order. Now I'll drag the title below the masked clip, making sure that it's above the background in the stacking order. Using the on-screen controls, I can place the text wherever I want relative to the subject, rotate it on any of its 3D axis points, and so on. And speaking of titles, Final Cut Pro 10.6.6 also has some new templates that look really nice. I'll move the playhead back to the shot of Kate, then select the Dynamic Titles category. Here you'll find 7 new themed templates that include 5 separate design elements: a bumper, a closing title, a lower third, a title, and animated text. I'm going to use this skylight template for Kate's background. I'll set the range endpoint at this first marker, then press Q to connect it. In the inspector, I'll set the blend mode to behind, then reposition and replace the text. Depending on the design element you choose, the title inspector will give you different options for changing the look. For this title, there are 3 different animations to choose from. I really like the look of animation 3. Additionally, you can change the background to a solid color, or even turn it off entirely if you want to use a different background. So to put a bow around this new AI-based keyer, I would say that it's definitely a tool I would use if I didn't have the time for a complicated green screen setup. Now, could this tool replace a green screen? Well, yes and no. It really depends on your willingness to live with a less than perfect final composite. If you need the best key possible because your client work demands it, this tool may not be your first choice. However, that same client may want you to shoot a number of short marketing videos for TikTok or Instagram, where there's a limited budget. That's the sweet spot where I believe this tool will really shine, and over time, I can only presume it will get more accurate as Apple trains the tool with more data points. I've been begging for more AI-based tools in Final Cut Pro for a long time, and I certainly won't complain when they show up at a pace slower than I'd like. The next new feature that I want to show you is not as sexy as the scene removal mask, but in my opinion, it's the biggest reason that you should upgrade to Final Cut Pro. Because working with HDR clips and SDR projects, and SDR clips and HDR projects is no longer the headache that it used to be. Apple calls this feature Automatic Color Conform. Now before I show you how it works, let me give you a brief explanation of how Final Cut Pro previously dealt with HDR clips so you can truly appreciate what I'm about to show you. Here, I have an SDR project open with several clips placed into it. By SDR, I mean Standard Dynamic Range, which defines a specific range of video brightness and color that is universally compatible with all televisions and computer displays going back decades. This is why when you create a library in Final Cut Pro, it defaults to SDR, not HDR. But now, most of us are carrying around phones that will record and display video in HDR, or High Dynamic Range. By comparison, an SDR monitor can display brightness at 100 nits, while HDR monitors can display brightness up to 1000 nits. In the browser, I've imported an HDR clip that I recorded on my iPhone. The info inspector tells me that this clip is in the Rec 2020 HLG color space, which is the particular flavor of HDR the iPhone records in. Adding this clip to the timeline, we see an unavoidable issue that we've all experienced when adding HDR clips to an SDR timeline. The clip appears blown out because the video was recorded with 10 times the brightness of what SDR displays are capable of resolving. Mark did a complete video on this subject a while back, and you can click the link in the description if you want a more detailed explanation. In the video, he demonstrated two methods for dealing with this issue. One method involved dropping the HDR Tools effect onto the clip, then in the inspector, changing the color conform mode to HLG to Rec 709 SDR. The other method was to apply one of Final Cut Pro's color correctors, then adjust the brightness manually. With Final Cut Pro's new automatic color conform, these methods are no longer necessary, though you're always free to color correct your clips if you need to, regardless of their native color space. I'll delete the clip in the timeline, then open Settings by pressing Command-, At the bottom of the General tab, there's a new checkbox labeled HDR Automatic Color Conform. Normally, this is enabled by default. I temporarily disabled it so I could show you how previous versions of Final Cut Pro would handle HDR clips in SDR projects. I'll close the Settings window, then drag the same HDR clip back into the timeline. Instantly, the clip is color conformed to the SDR color space and looks correct. This means that any HDR clip you add to the timeline will look correct. Prior to this update, the process was so confusing, many people turned off HDR recording on their phones just to avoid this hassle. As Steve Jobs used to say, it just works. But there are a few more related tools that I want to show you. Here I have an empty event that I want to import some HDR clips into. I'll drag these clips from the Finder directly into the event. Upon import, Final Cut Pro reads the metadata in the file to determine if any of the clips are HDR, then asks you if you want to switch the library to HDR or keep it as SDR. I'll choose Switch to HDR. I'll select a few clips, then right-click and choose New Project. I'll name the project, then set the resolution to 1080p HD. Newly created projects in an HDR library default to the Rec 2020 HLG color space, the same color space as the clips I recorded on my iPhone. Skimming over these clips, they look incredible on my MacBook Pro's display at 1000 nit brightness. However, my screen capture software is not capable of recording in HDR, so I had to drop the display brightness on my Mac to 500 nits in order to demonstrate these features. Now, I love editing and delivering in HDR because of the increased dynamic range and color gamut that my cameras are capable of recording. However, sometimes I need to add SDR clips to a project, and previously there was no easy way of converting them into the wide gamut color space and have them look good. In the browser is a clip that I shot in SDR on my GoPro camera. It looks rather dull compared to the HLG clips on either side of it. I'll press Command-7 to see this objectively in the video scopes. With the playhead over the clip, I'll open the video inspector and scroll toward the bottom of the window. There's a new option labeled Color Conform that, as the name suggests, will conform a clip or group of clips from one color space to another. From the pop-up menu, I'll choose Manual, then choose a conversion type. As you can see from these options, you can convert from SDR to HDR and HDR to SDR. Plus, you can convert from one flavor of HDR to another. I'm going to select SDR to 100% HDR HLG. Both the brightness and color are conformed to make this clip match the other HLG clips in the timeline. There's some pretty incredible math behind this tool. Looking at the exported clip on both my iPhone and my Mac XDR display, I couldn't easily tell this clip was not recorded in HDR natively. What's also cool is that if you have a bunch of clips that you need to convert, you can do so before adding them to the timeline. Just select a clip or group of clips in the browser, then choose your conversion option in the inspector. There's also a new color corrector that's specifically designed for HDR content, though you could use it for SDR content as well. I'll press Command-6 to open the color inspector, then from the color correctors menu choose Color Adjustments. A number of exposure and color sliders are exposed. Before you start moving sliders around, you want to make sure that you set the proper control range. Control range determines the correct brightness for the clips you're working with. This is important because it ensures the proper scaling of the sliders so that when you make adjustments to the shadows, midtones, and highlights, they affect the correct ranges in the image. Final Cut Pro will normally choose the correct control range based on your project settings. As you can see, HLG was chosen automatically. These sliders are self-explanatory. I can increase or decrease the exposure, adjust the contrast, the saturation, the black point, and so on. For this clip, I just need to make a few adjustments. Toggling the corrector on and off shows a marked improvement to the clip. With these new HDR tools, I can't wait to revisit some of my underwater projects shot in SDR and convert them to HDR. One question that comes up all the time is, why do my titles look so dull in my HDR projects? Well, that issue has finally been addressed, and any titles you add to HDR projects will be properly conformed to the proper brightness levels. I'll add a basic title over this beach shot, change the text, size, and font, then position it over the waves. Selecting the title inspector reveals an HDR level slider specifically designed for titles. By default, it's set to 95%, but you can bring it all the way up to 100 for the maximum brightness HLG will allow. You'll also find the same control slider on the built-in title templates. I'll add a lower third from the geometric design group, then adjust the HDR level in the inspector. If you're using your own logos or graphics, they'll also be auto-conformed to the brightness levels of your project. As I demonstrated with the GoPro clip, you can manually choose a conforming option. I'll set this to 100% HDR for maximum brightness. When you're ready to output your movies, there's a new sharing option labeled HEVC High Efficiency Video. In the Settings tab, you can choose a 10-bit video codec. But if you want your movie to look the best on Apple devices, make sure HEVC 10-bit HLG Dolby Vision 8.4 is selected. Any other setting will not add the metadata necessary for Dolby Vision playback. I'll click Next, name the movie, then save it to my Mac. By the way, if you want to see this clip on your HDR-capable device, I've included a link below. So those are the new features in Final Cut Pro 10.6.6. There's not a ton of them, but what Apple did give us are important tools that solve problems and help us work faster. Let me know in the comments what you think, and give us a sub if you haven't already, and thank you for watching.